Slavery, a brutal chapter in human history, has left an indelible mark on societies across the globe. From ancient civilizations where it was seen as a cornerstone of economic and social order, to modern times where its legacies still spark debates about racial inequality and justice, the practice of enslaving human beings stands as a stark testament to the depths of cruelty and the resilience of the human spirit. This documentary delves into 15 stark realities of the global slave trade, each revealing the complex interplay of power, economics, and human suffering. As we peel back layers of history, we uncover how the transatlantic slave trade systematically brutalized millions, people torn from their homes in Africa, enduring the inhuman conditions of the Middle Passage, only to face a life of servitude in strange lands. The sound of chains, the crack of the whip, and the silent tears in the night echo through time, reminding us of the profound human cost. But amidst this darkness there were flickers of resistance and hope. Enslaved men and women fought back, risking everything to reclaim their freedom. Uprisings and rebellions became beacons of resilience, showcasing the undying desire for dignity and human rights. Through these stories of unimaginable hardship and relentless resilience, we remember not only the souls entangled in chains, but also the cultures forever altered by this scourge. Join us as we journey through the dark past of slavery to understand its impact on our present. We explore the ongoing struggle for dignity and rights that continues to shape movements for justice and equality today. By confronting these harsh truths, we honor the enduring spirit of those who lived through the age of slavery and those who continue to fight against its lingering shadows. Slavery, the forced bondage and labor of individuals, has marred human history across various civilizations, tracing back to ancient times. The origins of slavery can be found in the earliest records of human civilization. Ancient societies such as those in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China all have documented evidence of enslaved individuals who were either captured during warfare, born into bondage, or sold into slavery due to debt or crime. In Mesopotamia, one of the earliest and most influential civilizations, the Code of Hammurabi, written around 1754 BC, includes laws regarding slavery, indicating its institutionalization in society. Slaves in Mesopotamia were primarily war captives or their descendants. They could own property and even conduct business, and in some cases they had opportunities for freedom. Similarly, in ancient Egypt, slaves were mainly prisoners of war who were utilized for their labor in massive state projects such as the construction of the pyramids and other monumental architecture. They were an integral part of the workforce, though the Egyptians also allowed them certain legal protections and the possibility of integration into society. The practice of slavery was not confined to the Near East. In the ancient civilizations of the Americas, such as the Aztecs and the Mayans, slavery was also a significant institution. Slaves were typically war captives or criminals, and their labor was used in both public works and private service. Ancient Greece and Rome further developed the systems of slavery, turning it into an economic foundation of their empires. In Rome, slaves were a central part of the economy, engaged in various professions from household servants to skilled artisans and even bureaucrats. Through these instances, it is evident that while the forms and functions of slavery differed, the concept of enslaving human beings permeated various cultures and was integral to their economic and social structures. This dark legacy illustrates the complex and troubling aspects of human societies throughout history. Let's examine those 15 facts that individuals must know about slave trade in the world. Fact number 1. The Middle Passage refers to the harrowing journey across the Atlantic Ocean, a crucial segment of the triangular trade route that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. This route was notoriously brutal, marking one of the darkest chapters of the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were transported by the tens of thousands in conditions that were unimaginably cruel and inhumane. Ships designed for the maximum capacity without regard for human life packed enslaved individuals tightly below decks. The conditions were squalid, the air was fetid with the smell of disease, human waste, and despair. Men, women, and children were shackled together with minimal space to move or breathe. The mortality rate was high due to disease, malnutrition, and abuse. Dysentery, scurvy, and smallpox were rampant, and many did not survive the journey. It is estimated that the Middle Passage claimed the lives of at least 2 million Africans during the era of the slave trade. The psychological and physical torment inflicted during the Middle Passage also served to dehumanize and break the spirit of the captives. The overseers employed brutal methods to maintain order and suppress any attempts at rebellion. Despite the harsh conditions, there were numerous recorded uprisings. Enslaved Africans resisted in whatever ways they could, through physical revolt, by preserving cultural practices, or by forming bonds among themselves on the ships. The legacy of the Middle Passage is profound, leaving a lasting impact on the descendants of those who survived. The journey not only represents the horrific treatment faced by enslaved Africans, but also their resilience and strength in the face of overwhelming adversity. It is a testament to the indomitable human spirit and a crucial story in the larger narrative of the African diaspora. Fact number 2. The economic impact of the slave trade was profound and far-reaching, fundamentally shaping the economies of the Americas and Europe. The forced labor of millions of Africans provided the critical manpower needed to cultivate and process lucrative cash crops such as sugar, cotton, and tobacco, which were in high demand in European markets. This labor-intensive agriculture underpinned the prosperity of colonies in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern United States, enabling these regions to generate immense wealth. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations were particularly dependent on slave labor. The intense, grueling work required to plant, harvest, and process sugarcane could not have been economically viable without the exploitation of enslaved Africans. The profits generated from sugar were astronomical and significantly boosted the economies of European nations, especially Britain and France, who heavily invested in these colonies. Similarly, in the United States, the cotton industry became a cornerstone of the economy by the 19th century, known famously as King Cotton. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 dramatically increased the efficiency of cotton processing and heightened the demand for slave labor. The wealth generated from cotton bolstered the American economy and financed industrial development, linking the prosperity of the northern textile industries directly to the toils of the southern slave plantations. The economic benefits of the slave trade also extended to other sectors, including shipping and manufacturing. European shipbuilders, insurers, merchants, and investors all profited immensely from the trade, creating a complex economic network that fueled the growth of the Atlantic economy. This network not only facilitated the trade in human lives, but also fostered the development of financial institutions and capital markets in Europe. The slave trade, therefore, was not merely a peripheral or shameful chapter in economic history. It was central to the economic transformation and modernization of the Western world. The wealth accumulated through these inhumane practices laid the groundwork for much of the economic development seen in the West today, making it a pivotal, if tragic, element of global economic history. Fact number 3. The legacy of slavery remains deeply ingrained in the social, economic, and cultural fabric of modern societies. Its effects extend beyond the lives directly impacted during the era of the slave trade, continuing to shape race relations, economic inequality, and cultural identities. The structures built on the labor of enslaved people provided a foundation for industries and institutions that still dominate global markets today. Meanwhile, the psychological and cultural scars of slavery persist in the form of systemic racism, intergenerational poverty, and ongoing struggles for equality and justice. Recognizing and addressing this legacy is critical. Around the world, educators, historians, and activists are working to ensure that the history of slavery is neither sanitized nor forgotten. Comprehensive education is a key tool in this effort. By teaching the realities of the slave trade, including the brutality, resistance, and resilience of enslaved people, Educators aim to foster a more informed and empathetic generation. Public school curricula, higher education courses, and community-led initiatives now increasingly include detailed accounts of slavery's origins, its global reach, and its lasting consequences. In addition, public memorials, museum exhibitions, and virtual resources have become vital in preserving the memory of those who endured slavery. Institutions like the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the United States and the International Slavery Museum in the United Kingdom offer visitors a chance to confront this past directly. These efforts not only educate but also encourage dialogue, understanding, and acknowledgement of historical injustices. As we move forward, the legacy of slavery serves as a cautionary reminder of the costs of dehumanization and exploitation. Through education, remembrance, and active efforts to dismantle systemic inequality, we can help ensure that future generations understand this history and are empowered to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. Fact number 4. Resistance and rebellions were pivotal elements in the history of slavery, embodying the resilience and courage of enslaved individuals who fought against their subjugation. Throughout the era of the slave trade, there were numerous uprisings that challenged the oppressive systems enforced by slaveholders. These acts of defiance were not only crucial for asserting the humanity and dignity of the enslaved, but also played significant roles in the eventual abolition of slavery. One of the most remarkable and successful rebellions was the Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Enslaved Africans, led by figures such as Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and François Macandal, mobilized against their French oppressors in a violent and protracted struggle that eventually led to the establishment of Haiti as the first Black republic and the second independent nation in the Western Hemisphere. This rebellion was unprecedented in its scale and success, and served as a beacon of hope for enslaved peoples across the Americas. In addition to the Haitian Revolution, there were numerous smaller but equally significant rebellions throughout the Americas and the Caribbean. The Stono Rebellion in 1739 in South Carolina, the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies, and the New York slave insurrection of 1741 are examples where enslaved people took up arms against their captors, facing brutal reprisals in their quest for freedom. Resistance also took more subtle forms, including work slowdowns, sabotage, escape, and the establishment of maroon communities, settlements of escaped slaves who managed to live independently. These communities, found in remote areas from Jamaica to Suriname to the swamps of Florida, resisted re-enslavement and maintained their freedom against colonial powers. These acts of resistance highlighted the inherent human drive for liberty and justice and were instrumental in undermining the moral and economic foundations of slavery. They forced the world to confront the brutal realities of the institution and contributed to its eventual downfall. Fact number 5. The path to the abolition of slavery was marked by significant legislative acts and tireless advocacy by abolitionists, both enslaved and free. These efforts gradually dismantled a deeply entrenched system of human bondage through a series of laws and declarations that varied significantly from one country to another. In the United Kingdom, the abolitionist movement gained momentum in the late 18th century, spearheaded by figures like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson. The British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act in 1807, which outlawed the transatlantic slave trade within the British Empire. This was followed by the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which emancipated all slaves in the British colonies. This legislation was a monumental step forward and set a precedent that many other countries would follow. In the United States, the abolitionist movement was also growing, with leaders like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and John Brown pushing for the end of slavery. The pivotal moment came during the Civil War, when President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were to be set free. This was solidified by the adoption of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1865, which abolished slavery throughout the entire country. Other nations followed suit in their own time, with France abolishing slavery in its colonies in 1848 after 2 prior temporary abolitions and reinstatements. Similarly, Portugal ended slavery in its colonies in 1869, and Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888 with the Golden Law. These legislative milestones were crucial in legally ending slavery, but they were often met with resistance and did not immediately result in equality or freedom for former slaves. Nonetheless, these laws were foundational in the global fight against slavery and represented a significant shift in the moral and legal landscape of the time. Fact number 6. The slave trade was not confined to the Atlantic. It also thrived in the East, where it shaped societies across the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, and within Africa itself. This lesser-known segment of the slave trade involved millions of individuals and had a profound impact on the regions involved. In the Indian Ocean, the slave trade was ancient, predating the European involvement by centuries. Arab traders were pivotal in this trade, transporting enslaved Africans across the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean to markets in the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, India, and even the far reaches of the Indonesian archipelago. The demand for labor in these regions, ranging from domestic servants to soldiers, drove a lucrative trade that lasted into the 20th century. Similarly, within Africa, internal slave trade routes flourished, moving from the interior regions to the coasts. Powerful African kingdoms and tribal leaders engaged in war and raiding for captives, who were then sold to both European and Arab traders. This internal market had a long history and was deeply integrated into the social and economic fabric of the continent. The impact of the slave trade in these eastern and internal routes was devastating. It led to significant depopulation in some areas, altered demographic patterns, and contributed to lasting political and social upheaval. The cultural impact was also significant, as it facilitated the spread of languages, religions, and other cultural practices across vast distances. Despite its profound impact, the slave trade in the East and within Africa is often less emphasized in historical narratives compared to the Atlantic trade. However, understanding these routes provides a more comprehensive picture of the scope and effects of slavery, highlighting the global nature of this human tragedy. Fact number 7. The slave trade brought to prominence a range of figures, both oppressors and abolitionists, whose actions profoundly impacted the course of history. These individuals' contributions ranged from perpetuating the brutal system of slavery to fighting vigorously for its abolition. Among the oppressors, figures like Edward Colston, a prominent English merchant and philanthropist, stand out. Despite his charitable contributions to the city of Bristol, Colston's wealth was largely accumulated through the exploitation of enslaved Africans as a member of the Royal African Company, which held a monopoly on the British slave trade in the late 17th century. His involvement in the slave trade has made his legacy a subject of controversy, particularly highlighted by the toppling of his statue during a Black Lives Matter protest in 2020. On the side of the abolitionists, Oloda Equiano, an African writer and abolitionist who was himself enslaved as a child, had a significant influence. His autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oloda Equiano, published in 1789, detailed his harrowing experiences as a slave and was a crucial piece of the abolitionist literature in Britain. The book provided a first-person perspective on the horrors of slavery, helping to sway public opinion against the trade. Another notable abolitionist was Harriet Beecher Stowe, an American author whose novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, played a pivotal role in changing American public opinion about slavery. The book, which depicted the brutal realities of slavery in the southern United States, became a bestseller and galvanized the abolitionist movement in the North. These individuals, among others, played key roles in the historical narrative of slavery. Whether through perpetuating its cruelties or fighting for its end, their actions left indelible marks on the chapters of world history, influencing subsequent generations' views on justice and human rights. Fact number 8. The cultural impact of slavery is profound and far-reaching, deeply embedded in the societies that participated in the trade. Enslaved Africans brought with them a rich tapestry of cultural practices, traditions, and knowledge that significantly influenced the New World's social and cultural landscape. In the Americas, the influence of African culture is most visibly evident in music and dance. African rhythms and musical practices melded with European and indigenous traditions to form unique new genres. In Brazil, the African influence is seen in samba and capoeira, a martial art that combines elements of dance, music, and acrobatics, developed by African slaves as a form of resistance and cultural preservation. In the Caribbean, African musical traditions contributed to the development of genres like reggae and calypso, while in the United States, the roots of jazz, blues, and even rock and roll can be traced back to the African musical heritage brought by slaves. Cuisine is another area where the impact of African slaves is evident. African culinary practices, ingredients, and flavors were introduced into local cuisines, becoming staples in the Americas. In the southern United States, dishes such as gumbo, jambalaya, and soul food have direct links to African cooking techniques and ingredients. Similarly, the use of okra and rice in Brazilian and Caribbean cuisine demonstrates this influence. Religious practices also bear the marks of African influence. Many slaves, despite being forcibly converted to Christianity, managed to retain elements of their traditional African religions. This syncretism is seen in religions such as Voodoo in Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, and Candomblé in Brazil, which blend African spiritual beliefs with Christian elements. These cultural legacies of slavery, born out of a brutal history, are a testament to the resilience and creativity of African slaves. They managed to preserve and adapt their cultures in profoundly hostile and oppressive environments, profoundly influencing the cultural landscapes of the Americas. Fact number 9. Modern-day slavery, a disturbing echo of its historical counterpart, continues to afflict millions worldwide through human trafficking and forced labor. Despite the formal abolition of slavery in the 19th century, contemporary forms of enslavement persist, reflecting deep-seated economic and social inequalities that exploit vulnerable populations. Human trafficking represents a significant aspect of modern-day slavery, involving the illegal trade of people for exploitation or commercial gain. Every year, men, women, and children are trafficked across international borders and within countries. Victims are often lured with false promises of well-paying jobs or manipulated through coercive tactics, only to find themselves forced into prostitution, labor, and other forms of exploitation. Forced labor is another prevalent form of modern slavery, where individuals are compelled to work against their will under threat of punishment. It spans various industries, from agriculture and construction to domestic work and manufacturing. Often workers are trapped in endless cycles of debt, their passports withheld and their movements restricted, effectively binding them to their employers. The issue is exacerbated by global poverty and lack of economic opportunities, making vulnerable populations more susceptible to exploitation. In regions plagued by war and conflict, the chaos and displacement can lead to an increase in all forms of human trafficking. Global efforts to combat modern-day slavery are in place, including international treaties and laws like the United Nations Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. Additionally, various non-governmental organizations work tirelessly to rescue victims, provide them with necessary rehabilitation services, and advocate for stronger protective measures and stricter enforcement of existing laws. Raising awareness about these contemporary issues is crucial. Understanding the manifestations of modern-day slavery is the first step towards mobilizing global efforts to eradicate it and ensuring that the atrocities of the past are not perpetuated into the future. Fact number 10. The question of reparations and public apologies for the historical injustices of slavery has gained increasing attention in recent decades. Nations and corporations that once benefited from this brutal trade are being called to account, with demands for acknowledgement and compensation to the descendants of enslaved peoples. Several countries and institutions have made formal apologies for their roles in the slave trade. In 2007, marking the bicentennial of the abolition of the slave trade in Britain, then Prime Minister Tony Blair made a formal public apology for Britain's profoundly shameful role in the slavery. Similarly, in 2008, the United States House of Representatives passed a resolution apologizing for slavery and subsequent discriminatory laws against African Americans. On the corporate front, some companies that traced their prosperity back to the slave trade era have also issued apologies and have set up reparations funds. For example, some major banks in the USA acknowledged their historical complicity in slavery and have contributed to educational and community programs aimed at supporting African American communities. Despite these gestures, the debate over reparations remains contentious. Proponents argue that apologies are insufficient without substantive economic reparations to address the centuries of socio-economic disadvantages suffered by the descendants of slaves. They advocate for reparations in various forms, such as educational scholarships, housing grants, and financial compensation to help redress the systemic inequalities rooted in slavery. Opponents, however, claim that current generations should not be held accountable for the misdeeds of their forebears, and that the logistical challenges of implementing reparations are insurmountable. The dialogue on reparations is complex, involving moral, historical, and practical considerations. It demands a profound examination of the impacts of slavery and colonialism and poses significant challenges on how best to address these historical injustices in a meaningful and effective way. The path forward is fraught with challenges but remains a crucial part of the broader discussions on justice and equality. Fact number 11. Personal stories and narratives from enslaved individuals provide a powerful and intimate perspective on the realities of slavery, bringing to life the human aspects behind the abstract numbers and historical analyses. These accounts are crucial for understanding the personal suffering and resilience of those who lived through one of the darkest chapters in human history. One of the most famous narratives is that of Frederick Douglass, an American social reformer and abolitionist who escaped slavery. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, published in 1845, details his life in bondage and his ambition for freedom, providing a first-hand account of the dehumanizing effects of slavery. His eloquent and powerful descriptions helped to fuel the abolitionist movement in the pre-Civil War United States. Another poignant account is from Harriet Jacobs, whose autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861, provides a rare insight into the sexual exploitation and abuse that enslaved women were subjected to. Jacobs' narrative also sheds light on her determined struggle for freedom for herself and her children, highlighting the unique challenges faced by enslaved women. Equally compelling are the WPA slave narratives, a collection of interviews conducted in the 1,930 cests with former enslaved people. These narratives provide a broad spectrum of experiences and reflect the everyday life of slaves in the American South. They include stories of brutality and humanity, illustrating the complex relationships between slaves and their owners and the various forms of resistance and accommodation they employed to survive. These personal stories are vital for a full understanding of slavery. They not only document the horrors and injustices, but also celebrate the strength, courage, and humanity of individuals who endured and resisted these conditions. By preserving these voices, we honor their memory and ensure that the lessons of their lives continue to inform and inspire future generations. Fact number 12. The legacy of slavery is profoundly etched into the economic disparities observed between races today, particularly between black and white populations in countries that were heavily involved in the slave trade. These disparities are the direct result of centuries of systemic racism, discriminatory policies, and the economic exploitation inherent in slavery. In the United States, the economic foundations built on slave labor created vast wealth for white slaveholders and their descendants, while the freed African American population was systematically denied access to similar economic opportunities. After the abolition of slavery, laws such as black codes and Jim Crow laws further entrenched racial segregation and economic inequality. These laws limited access to quality education, decent housing, and employment opportunities for Black Americans, creating a cycle of poverty that persists in many communities today. The gap is evident in various economic indicators, including wealth, income, employment rates, and access to capital. For example, the racial wealth gap is stark, with the median white family holding significantly more wealth than its black counterpart. This disparity is compounded by historical inequalities in homeownership rates, access to higher education, and inheritance wealth, which have been crucial in building and transferring wealth across generations. Efforts to address these issues have included policies aimed at affirmative action, fair housing laws, and equal employment opportunities. However, the effectiveness of these measures has been limited by ongoing discrimination and structural barriers that continue to hinder significant progress. Acknowledging and addressing the economic legacies of slavery is crucial for achieving racial equality. This involves not only rectifying historical injustices through policies such as reparations, but also dismantling the existing structures that continue to perpetuate economic disparities. A comprehensive approach that includes education, policy reform, and community investment is essential to close these gaps and ensure equitable economic opportunities for all. Fact number 13. The portrayal of slavery in educational settings is a critical aspect of how societies understand and interpret their pasts, often stirring controversy over the depth and nature of the content presented. In countries with histories deeply intertwined with slavery, the way this topic is taught can significantly influence societal attitudes and understanding of racial issues. In the United States, the teaching of slavery in schools has been a subject of intense debate. Critics argue that many school curriculums tend to downplay the horrors of slavery, often presenting it as a secondary issue within the broader context of American history. There is a push for a more comprehensive approach that does not shy away from the brutal realities of slavery and its lasting impact on African American communities. Programs like the 1619 Project aim to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the center of the U.S. historical narrative. In contrast, other countries might barely touch on the subject, if at all, leaving significant gaps in the public's understanding of global history. For example, in some European countries, where overseas colonies were heavily involved in the slave trade, national curriculums often lack detailed discussion of their own roles in perpetuating slavery and its global impacts. The approach to teaching slavery is also evolving in places like Brazil, which received more African slaves than any other country during the transatlantic slave trade. Brazilian schools are increasingly including Afro-Brazilian history and culture in their curriculums to provide a more accurate and inclusive representation of the nation's history. Effective education about slavery is vital not only for historical accuracy, but also for addressing racial prejudices and promoting understanding among different communities. It involves exposing students to the uncomfortable truths of history, thereby fostering a more informed and empathetic society that understands the roots of current racial inequalities and is motivated to address them. Fact number 14. Public memorials and monuments dedicated to the history of slavery play a significant role in shaping collective memory and initiating dialogue about this dark period in history. These monuments are often at the center of public and scholarly debate regarding how societies remember and interpret the past, particularly the painful realities of slavery. In various countries, especially those directly involved in the transatlantic slave trade, monuments and memorials serve as tools for education and reflection. For instance, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, USA, opened in 2018, is dedicated to the legacy of enslaved Black people, victims of lynching, and those subjected to racial segregation and contemporary presumptions of guilt and police violence. This memorial, with its haunting display of hanging steel columns representing each county where lynchings occurred, powerfully conveys the terror of racial injustice and the enduring scars left by slavery and its aftermath. Similarly, the door of no return in Ouidah, Benin, stands as a stark reminder of the last exit point for thousands of slaves bound for the Americas. This monument provides a place for reflection and reconciliation, not only for the descendants of those who were enslaved, but also for the wider community to confront and acknowledge their shared history. In the Caribbean, countries like Jamaica and Barbados have erected memorials to honor the resilience and contributions of enslaved Africans. These sites often become focal points during national ceremonies like Emancipation Day, serving as a reminder of the strength and survival of those who endured slavery. However, the presence of monuments related to slavery can also spark controversy, particularly when they are seen to glorify figures associated with the perpetration of slavery. Debates and actions surrounding the removal or reinterpretation of such statues, as seen with the Edward Colston statue in Bristol, UK, highlight the ongoing struggle to reconcile historical narratives with contemporary values of equality and justice. Through these public memorials and monuments, societies confront their histories, commemorate those who suffered, and educate future generations about the horrors of slavery to ensure such injustices are never repeated. Fact number 15. Slave trade routes were critical in shaping the global landscape during the era of slavery, connecting continents and facilitating the mass movement of enslaved Africans. These routes, which were primarily driven by European colonial powers, spanned across the Atlantic Ocean and were part of a larger network known as the Triangular Trade. This network linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas, creating a complex system that was economically beneficial to European traders and devastating to African communities. The most notorious of these routes was the Middle Passage, which ferried enslaved Africans from West Africa to the Americas. Ships loaded with human cargo would depart from ports like Gorée Island in Senegal, Elmina Castle in Ghana, and Luanda in Angola. These journeys were harrowing, with enslaved Africans packed into cramped, unsanitary conditions below decks, suffering immense hardships during the transatlantic crossing. The mortality rates were high due to disease, malnutrition, and abuse, with countless lives lost in transit. In addition to the Atlantic routes, there were also extensive networks across the Indian Ocean and the Sahara Desert. In the Indian Ocean, enslaved people were transported from the eastern coast of Africa to markets in the Middle East, India, and even the far reaches of Indonesia. The Trans-Saharan routes connected sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, where enslaved individuals were sold to markets in the Mediterranean and Europe. Understanding these trade routes is crucial for comprehending the scale and systemic nature of the slave trade. They illustrate how slavery was embedded in the global economic system, impacting the demographic and cultural landscapes of multiple continents. Today, the remnants of these routes serve as historical sites, providing education about the brutal realities of the slave trade and fostering reflection on the need for reconciliation and healing. As we reflect on the complex and painful history of the slave trade, it is crucial to remember that this dark chapter is not just a story of brutality and suffering, but also one of resilience and resistance. The legacy of slavery continues to influence our societies, reminding us of the work still needed to combat racial injustice and inequality. Understanding the full scope of the slave trade through its routes, impacts, and the enduring spirit of those who were enslaved helps us appreciate the depth of human resilience and the importance of fighting for justice. The stories we've shared today are just the beginning. There's much more to learn and many more stories to uncover that can enlighten, inspire, and drive us to make a positive change in our world today. By subscribing to the Stories of Legends channel on YouTube, you join a community dedicated to uncovering the truths of our past and honoring the legacies of those who paved the way for a better future. Don't miss out on the opportunity to gain a deeper understanding of history and its lasting impacts. Subscribe to the Stories of Legends channel on YouTube and be part of a movement that seeks not only to remember, but to learn and grow from the lessons of history. Click subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us continue this journey of exploration and understanding together. Every view, every subscriber counts in spreading knowledge and fostering a more just and informed world. Join us now, and let's keep the stories of legends alive.